how FAA's $45 billion nextrgen is harming you, your family, and your future. FAA's concentrated flight paths has resulted in never-ending loud plane noise and air pollution over dense residential urban populations. Hazardous health conditions have been created while the public is being forced to subsidize this exploitation, thievery, and thuggery. From rural areas to urban dense populations, millions of Americans are being abused underneath FAA's unrestricted flight paths, creating dangerous levels of excessive noise and emitting ultra-fine particles and toxic pollutants over the same communities. The FAA's nextrgen has destroyed our residential communities, while immoral and unethical politicians establish no-fly zones over their own homes and properties. Their own families are safe and able to sleep without fear of plane noise, while the same politicians, cushioned by bribes from powerful lobbyists, betray the American public, voting to deregulate our airspace, food supply, financial system, and housing, all for their greed and profiteering. Despite a huge outcry from the American public, the FAA has continued to maintain a false narrative and expand FAA's nextrgen all across American cities, even rural areas. By subjecting people to a prolonged bombardment of noise and physical intimidation, rogue air pilots with the help of the FAA and politicians have been violating aviation safety standards while inflicting lasting harm on American people's mental health and physical well-being. The strategic nature of these low-flying, intense, dangerous, and abusive operations have intended to make victims feel trapped, powerless, or isolated, and constitutes a form of psychological warfare. This goes beyond negligence and becomes a deliberate form of bullying and abuse, which is compounded by the refusal of FAA, corrupt local and federal politicians to intervene and put a stop to these harmful and abusive attacks. The FAA and the airline and aviation industry continue deceiving the public by muffling any opposition to these concentrated flight paths and by targeting fed-up residents with more foul noise and air traffic abuse. The truth is that millions of Americans all across the country have been screaming about next-gen generated airline pattern impacts and abusive general aviation airports' closed pattern work for more than a decade now. And there has been plenty of noise about repetitive flight patterns for recreational pilots and flight schools' closed patterns that import flight students from foreign countries. Despite a huge outcry from the American public, the FAA has continued to maintain a false narrative and expand FAA's nextrgen all across American cities, even rural areas. The FAA and Trump's U.S. Department of Transportation just delivered the biggest gift to abusive general aviation, MOSAIC, from oversight to enabler. FAA's MOSAIC rewards irresponsible general aviation over populated area. Despite the opposition to MOSAIC, the FAA and U.S. Department of Transportation just passed MOSAIC, knowing this will exacerbate the noise and abuse of general aviation. Abusive general aviation can now legally fly experimental planes, violating all safety standards, with features like retractable landing gear and constant speed propellers. The noise will be deafening over and over, much lower in altitude, much louder in terms of noise, and much bigger in size, buzzing your home 24/7. Recreational pilots can also utilize a current and valid driver's license instead of rigorous medical tests that were once required. Through MOSIAC, the FAA just empowered general aviation to conduct military style of raids above dense populations and target populated areas 24/7. While other nations invest in high-speed rail to improve public transportation and benefit the majority, the FAA continues to prioritize a tiny fraction of the population. This elite group who can afford to own, lease, or charter private jets, fixed-wing aircraft, and helicopters receives generous incentives, including subsidies, free access to public airspace, and cheap parking at general aviation airports. All of this comes at the expense of public health, environmental justice, and equitable infrastructure. Through aggressive lobbying by the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, the U.S. Congress and FAA have enacted the so-called CARES Act, granting general aviation pilots the ability to shield their flight tracking data, names, and addresses from public FAA databases. This move is designed to protect GA operators from accountability, public scrutiny, and potential nuisance lawsuits, further insulating an already privileged minority at the expense of transparency and community rights. This is the same gridlocked Congress that refuses to pass meaningful legislation to raise the altitude of the FAA's toxic low-flying planes over urban areas, or to implement real reforms to end the ongoing harms of FAA's nextrgen program. While countries like those in the EU and China invest heavily in modern infrastructure and public transportation, such as high-speed rail and maglev for safe, efficient commuting, the FAA and Department of Transportation continue pushing low-altitude experimental aircraft, air taxis, flying cars over densely populated neighborhoods, subjecting families to constant noise and pollution from above. China's maglev is faster than planes, it's cheap for everyday commute, and it produces no noise. This is what happens in countries that refuse to tolerate government corruption, where leaders actually care about their citizens' well-being and quality of life, rather than selling out to special interests. In contrast, thanks to members of Congress and a complicit federal and local government, America's infrastructure and transportation systems are outdated and neglected. We've seen little meaningful progress since World War II. Airports are overcrowded, under-maintained, and chaotic, while the public is left to endure a growing list of safety failures. Runway near misses, mid-air collisions, and frequent crashes of small aircraft over densely populated neighborhoods. These are not accidents. They're symptoms of a broken system prioritizing profit and political gain over public safety. This is the future the FAA and U.S. Department of Transportation are actively investing in, one that sacrifices the health and well-being of millions living under increasingly oppressive flight paths. The FAA's leadership is plagued by conflicts of interest. Most notably, its current head previously owned an air taxi company. With such deep industry ties, they cannot credibly represent the interests of the broader public. The FAA, U.S. Department of Transportation, and members of Congress are betraying the American people. Instead of protecting communities, they are enabling a system driven by greed and corruption. As a result, America is descending into a state of lawlessness, environmental abuse, and disregard for human life, all to serve the interests of a privileged few. As Chris Hedges writes in American Enemy, in an era of rulelessness, society invites self-destruction, rewarding narcissists, demagogues, and con artists who lack empathy and remorse. The political elite, members of Congress, and corrupt officials sacrifice nothing for the public good and face no consequences for their actions. As Matt Taibbi describes, they operate from a stateless archipelago, insulated from the damage they cause. From this safe distance, they pillage the nation, accumulate obscene wealth, and exert unchecked political and legal power, while the rest of the country bears the cost. The question now is, how long will the American public tolerate this criminal abuse and exploitation, while the political and corporate elite continue to rob them blind? How long will you endure it, watching as these unaccountable agencies destroy your health, your family's well-being, and your children's future? They show no intention of stopping. Every day they continue to sacrifice millions of lives beneath toxic noise, chemical exposure, financial, moral, and environmental decay, all in pursuit of profit and power. Protect your environment, protect your children, protect your home, and protect your community. Be the activist who pushes back when FAA and aviation industry cross the line. Thank you for your support.